I went on a national board together, and what I quickly realized that Ranjit was one of the most informed and engaged advocates for the most disenfranchised of anyone I'd ever met. Ranjit has a long career in the areas, everything from a high school teacher in the D.C. area to working as the senior strategist for ACT, for College Board, and now obviously with INCEPT, which is, many of you know, the probably foremost organization working with first-generation kids in high school, working with K-12 organizations, parents, community members, as well as post-secondary. And when we were looking to have someone talk about the first pillar in our new agenda of opportunity, and knowing that much of that pillar is made up of access and affordability and the process of getting many of our kids from point A to point Z, it was quickly identified that Ranjit was the man we needed to have. Now, Ranjit's schedule's fairly busy. Today's his birthday, by the way, so you may want to sing happy birthday to him. No. But Ranjit's, he's heading off to Malaysia end of this week, and as a matter of fact, he's coming back to Kentucky for the conference on counseling and advising in about a month or so in northern Kentucky. But without further ado, Ranjit, thank you.
Good morning, everyone. How are you doing today? Sounds like you had a great day yesterday. I managed to catch part of it. It is really an honor to be here. When I was invited, when Aaron called me to speak, at first I was a little thrown off. I don't think I've ever spoken to a room where the percentage of people in the room seemingly seemed to be in charge. Because many of the educators I speak with, aren't sort of trustee, regents, president level in totality. But I am really excited to be here. I will say that I did make this caveat to Aaron. I'm not a professional speaker. I have a regular job which occupies most of my time. Every now and then I pop my head out and give a speech. And so let me just make one clear distinction about professional speakers and people like me. Professional speakers, when you bring them in, you tell them, I want you to speak for about 35 minutes. And they speak. They literally end on 35 minutes. The best you're going to get out of me in terms of a promise is eventually this is going to end. So let me move down here. Oh, I've got to pull up some slides. That's what I've got to do. These are my slides. Perfect. Yeah, you added a few cover slides I didn't recognize. Okay, great. So let me move down here, and I just want to also say that it is my birthday today, a little bit older, but I have a broken toe. And so if it looks like I'm sort of hobbling around here, I am. But I will tell you, when I read the strategic agenda summary that's in front of you and the whole theme around opportunity, success, impact, the whole mindset of it was so positive. And so I decided that, I was going to be positive as well. And so when I looked at the agenda today with my broken toe, I thought, gosh, what an opportunity agenda. With my broken toe, I have an excuse to sleep in rather than join that group that was running at 6:30 in the morning today in the rain. So I started on a very positive note. So let me tell you what I want to talk about today. I didn't put this slide in, by the way, of me. Aaron said that you guys are, about to sort of launch. Bob and Aaron have been, working diligently around this new strategic agenda. And as Aaron said, I was the Senior Vice President of Corporate Strategy and New Product Development at the College Board for a couple of years, and I had a similar role at ACT. And one thing I know about strategy is this, when you launch strategy, is that no matter how much work you put into it, how much focus grouping, how much due diligence you put in, is all the employees at the organizations that I worked at, even at the one I work at now, is if they don't know how their job changes because of the new strategy, what they're going to do differently, the strategy is really for naught. If they don't know how behaviors will change within a system to meet the new metrics, to meet the new ambition, in essence, if strategy really isn't sort of infused into the culture or the way of being of what we do differently, it is just really great descriptive language in some ways. And so what I want to talk about today is not really, anything rocket science-wise. I just want to reflect on 3 key points throughout my career that keep me thinking daily about what I'm doing and how we're served. The programs we work with serve about 550,000 low-income kids a year in about 43 states and communities across the country. What keeps me thinking about how to be better, and as your sort of theme for the whole event, how do we have a strategy that eventually is designing to what the future is going to look like? How that meets up. So I'm going to hit on 3 key points. And so let me start, and I entitled this Chasing Ivan for a reason. So a long time ago, I was a high school teacher. So this was me, right? So now I know when you look at this, you think, like, why am I going to listen to this guy? That's what the kid who drew this during my social studies class thought, obviously, as well. He didn't listen to me at all. He drew this. Put it in my mailbox at the end of the day. That's Surrattsville High School in PG County. But what you're going to hear today is kind of still grounded back to this day, when I taught high school in D.C. and Prince George's County, and about the kids we were serving, which were largely underserved low-income students. The reason I've entitled it Chasing Ivan is this, because it's haunted me since I left and what I'm chasing to this day. So Ivan was this kid in my high school class. He was in 10th grade. And I was a second-year teacher, right? So I kind of went through a pretty innovative teacher preparation program. But second-year teacher, you're dealing with classroom management, all sorts of stuff. So I was in my class, and I taught in schools that had about a 50% daily attendance rate. All right, so if you're on block scheduling Monday, Wednesday, Friday, for example, and you're on 50%, maybe you saw a kid Monday and Friday. Right, so Ivan shows up every now and then, African-American student, about 6'4", a big kid, but he was a ghost in the school. Didn't speak to anybody, rarely spoke to me. Just showed up, never did any homework. Couldn't really find anybody to get in touch with to have a parent-teacher conference. All I could find out was already had 2 older siblings locked up. So Ivan's in my class, and before I started teaching, I spent 2 years in the oil industry doing strategy, right? So when I shifted, I thought I was going to be in that classroom forever. I did it intentionally. I picked D.C. and Prince George's County intentionally. So Ivan's in my class, does nothing most of the year. And then we do a unit on civil rights in U.S. history. And we're studying Gandhi's influence on the civil rights movement and nonviolence. And the kids were allowed to demonstrate their proficiency of that unit in multiple ways. They could take a quiz, they could do a presentation, whatever. They had a couple of different options to demonstrate their proficiency. I show up that day, Ivan comes in with a collage. Stands up in front of the class and, verbally communicates what's in the collage, what he learned in the unit. I couldn't believe it. At the end of the day, I sat in my little desk. This was the mid-'90s. And I thought, my God, the light bulb is on with Ivan. This is why I did it. This is why I made the shift. Ivan never did any more homework all year. That was it. Right? So then at the end of the school year, my second year, the graduate program that I had done this certification in, and my master's in ed in, came to me and said, hey, we want you to run some partnership programs with high schools. Come work for us and run these collaboratives throughout the metropolitan D.C. region. I struggled with the decision mightily. I thought I was going to close that classroom door and come out, 30 years later. So I decided to do it. And it was the last day of school. Kids were already gone, right? I packed my little box. All there was a teacher lunch, teacher appreciation lunch. And so what they were also during the lunch going to, honor with a little plaque the teachers that weren't coming back, and I was one of them. And recently they had a string of break-ins in our school. Couldn't figure it out. Constantly the alarms were being set off in this school. And So I get to the lunch, and I sit down. My last day, my last 30 minutes in a high school. And the teacher sits next to me and said, "Hey, did you hear they had another break-in last night?" And I said, "No, what happened?" They said, "Kid broke in to get to the computer lab. Alarms went off. Cops came. They let the dogs in the hallway. Dogs mauled the kid." And literally, it's my last minutes in the classroom. I'm like, "Who's the kid?" "Ivan." So my light bulb kid that I attached kind of like all my meaning of why I did it just got mauled by the dogs. And I'm on my way out with my box with all my little things. So I'm at NCEP now. I'm at college. I was at the college board. I was at ACT. But I'm still chasing Ivan after all these years. And what I hope after this presentation, again, it may not be anything revolutionary, that it gives you some things to think about in terms of what maybe you're chasing in terms of service to students. So the three things I want to talk about are this today. And again, I just picked three reflections based on very interesting experiences either in the corporate education sector, the nonprofit, or the classroom. The first is the idea of system impact. What are we trying to do collectively? The second is how do we view the time frame on that, which I think is really critical in what's driving a lot of the debate about post-secondary education right now. And finally, this uneasy tension between demand and supply, or supply and demand in this world, between sort of the education products and the education policies that exist to support an ecosystem, and in some ways the tension of the need that's out there. So let me start. I'm a social studies teacher, so I use artifacts, right? So let me start. For each one of those, I have an artifact. So for system impact, here's my artifact. All right, it's a toilet paper roll from this Marriott. And so I'm going to talk about an underwater robot and obviously a bubble test, all right, to exemplify sort of those 3 points. So the first is system impact. So I heard it yesterday. You hear it all the time. Like people are viewing this pathway as sort of a race, a baton race, right? A relay race for the students and them navigating systems and their pathway in general. So I thought a lot about what happened to Ivan all those years ago. And happens every day. It's relatively silent what happens to Ivan. I can't go find him in the National Student Clearinghouse database right now, right? So let me kind of demonstrate what I think happened to Ivan for a second. So can I get 2 volunteers to come up here? It could even be 2 of the runners from this morning since this is a relay race demonstration. All right. I have broken toes, so there you go. Perfect. All right, so this is a picture of a relay race handoff, right? Now, can I have you guys just probably in slow-mo just because of liability issues? Come on over here. You're going to receive the baton, right? You're going to hand it to her like we were doing a relay race. Just like in this picture. Give it a little more room. So this is what a relay race should look like. Now, I say that not knowing what they're about to do, right? So you never want to be on a high wire act where you can't control it. But here we go. Here's the relay race. Perfect. Hey, can we get a hand for that? All right. Now, what did you notice about that in that picture? One's looking backwards, reaching backwards, right? What else? Could you say it a little louder? Hand off to different hands. Interesting. Hand off to different hands. Is that the way it's supposed to be? Okay. Depends on how you've been coached. What else? Partnering together. They're still trying to complete it in here. A couple other things. They're both running at the same time. There's no abrupt handoff. It's not like a stop and a start. It's continual motion. The other important thing about this in this picture is that they're in the same lane. Right? They're in the same lane. Now let me show you what I think happened to Ivan all those years ago. If I could just borrow you. Stand right here. And at this pace that I'm speaking, I think this thing could be about an hour and 20-minute speech. Come on over here. So here's what we were asking Ivan to do. Without moving, get that baton to her. Here, I'll move her up a little bit right here. Right? Without moving, we were asking Ivan and a ton of kids to make that transition. Right? There just is not enough weight and substance in the baton for them to navigate, for him to have navigated in transition. So I represent, go ahead and stand there for a second. I represent the Gear Up program nationally, right? And I'm not selling the Gear Up model at all. But here's what I want you to think about for a second as you inherit so many kids at the post-secondary level for this transition. Whether they're moving, whether the system's reaching back. The goal, if we increase the level of readiness, right, academic and skills. And when I talk about skills, I'm talking about non-cognitive skills. At ACT, we bucketed them into motivation, social engagement, self-regulation. But we're also talking about 21st century skills that people talked about yesterday at the lunch, the governor, right? What does it take? Teamwork. So non-cognitive, 21st century skills, and academic content knowledge. If we get kids to a level of readiness and understand it, we can move Ivan up. Right here. Right into the lane. Right? Now, I'm not saying when. Could we have caught Ivan up from 10th grade to 12th grade? Maybe not. But we get him into the lane. Then, there you go. If you increase their level of aspiration and relevancy to why they're doing it, why go to college? What's the relationship to work in the long run? Right? And I'll make a caveat about work in a second. We move Ivan up 2 steps. Or 3 steps. There you go. And then if we give the kids sort of the college and career knowledge, we start in no later than 7th grade. But if we give them all the knowledge to make decision points all the way along the pathway, the right decision points, based on the opportunities they're trying to seize. Early rigorous courses, for example. Algebra by 9th grade. Info about FAFSA, testing, whatever it may be. We move them up again. And the theory of action then, another step is to be able to make that handoff with enough substance to make key transition points. Right? So my point for you is this. First of all, thank you. You can keep that.
Thank you.
Thanks for volunteering. My point is when you look at the strategic plan as it documents progression, degrees, persistence, all those sorts of things that are documented, we also need to look between the lines on the strategic plan in terms of what are the levels of readiness in what, to navigate what. So when I look at the system, right, we've got these massive handoff points. Now, as the governor yesterday rightly said, it actually starts, preschool. I've got a 5- and 7-year-old. Started early, right? It starts very early. But in terms of formal system hands-off, elementary, I take the first 5 years of career when I think about it. For a second. There's key transition points, right? What do they need to know and be able to do when for those handoffs? So at the post-secondary level, I think what's coming into the discourse a lot is what is that? Other than graduation and a degree, what is that? How do you describe that? How do you quantify that? So when I think about it, and this is what I tried to get ACT and College Board to think about a lot, to move them from a testing company to an education one, with a few successes and a few failures on my part, this is what I started to think about. First of all, for many of you, you know, I was ecstatic to hear that your readiness levels went up from 3 years ago, I think it was stated yesterday, to now in terms of the level of readiness based on how you measure it. But you know most kids are coming, and you don't have a full shot. You don't have a full view of that readiness because most aren't ready. Right? And if you're using an academic test like the ACT for readiness, you're looking at the academic domain. They still have to navigate post-secondary in a lot of other ways, non-cognitive ways. So whatever it is, knowing that level of readiness is critical. Right? But when I look at it, I don't look at it as graduation from transition points. And I'm not asking you to agree with me, whether you want to, I'm not trying to convince you to look at it this way. I'm just trying to give you something to think about as you try to digest the strategy moving forward. I think about what are all the things they need to know and be able to do at key transition points, and how is that weighted? Why it's so important here is this. Now, I've got an icon of someone in the world of work. What I really mean there is citizenship, career, all those things down the line, right? But the country got consumed by college and career readiness. And they did a terrible job on career, in my opinion, in defining it, in standards and other things, which I'll talk about. So I think about, what does someone need to look like to be successful? Not when they graduate from college, but after the first 5 years of work. If I had a database that had every Kentucky graduate from a post-secondary institution, and I matched them to LinkedIn, I'd be fascinated to know how they navigated those first 5 years. What did it look like in terms of those progressions? How many stayed in their chosen degree field? How many really started to emerge in kind of leadership roles in some ways? And 5 years may not be enough, but it starts to get a little unwieldy. Right? But you have to look at the race, the labor market, in the same lane as the education market. Because it's really just one preparation race. So when I think about it, I think about here and I work backwards. Right? And this is one of the things I learned at ACT, actually. How do you reverse engineer the process? When they build the ACT, this is what they look at, the actual test, whether you like it or not, whether you're test optional, whether you've adopted it. They look at what does it take for a kid to succeed in credit-bearing first-year college courses, credit-bearing. They aggregate what that body of knowledge looks like, and they test for that. Are they ready to go into that to be able to succeed? Forecasting a level of probability. That's how they get their scores, right? What I like about that is not necessarily the test itself, is that mindset of looking at success and saying on a growth model, all the way back in 8th grade, we can start to determine on a learning progression, age-appropriate learning progression, what a kid needs to know and whether they're on track. Not in an accountability way or a punitive way, but to catch them up or to get them ready. So when I think about post-secondary education, where my boys, who are now 5 and 7, when they go eventually, what is post-secondary education preparing them to do? Right? I think you're at an optimal time to have that discussion because you're launching this strategic agenda, which needs to be sort of delineated a bit more from where it is. It needs to be operationalized, digested by every institution, every worker. How does their job change based on this new agenda? So tied to that mindset of reverse engineering, what someone needs to know to be successful, mapping it back, I see my son Eli, I see him not playing well with someone. I think, boy, that forebodes some bad teamwork. down the line in the world of work. Right? Everything back maps to some degree in terms of what you're nurturing in people. So when I think about the time frame, the problem is for me, historically, is that having been so deep in the education system, the time frame was always the education pathway. So let me share another artifact. Anybody know what this is? This is an underwater robot. All right, you drop it in a swimming pool. They do it in those STEM robotics competitions, and you control it, and it can do all sorts of things underwater. All right, has anybody seen the movie Underwater Dreams? It's a documentary. So we had an annual conference this year, and we screened it. I happened to meet the director of it at a screening in D.C. So here's the movie, and it's a fairly political movie, and I'm not making a political statement. Here's the gist of it. 4 kids from a school in Arizona, a low-income school, undocumented kids, Hispanic. They're in the middle of Arizona. Their teachers decide they're going to create an underwater robotics club. Right? So these kids do it. 10 years ago this happened. Right? These kids join. I mean, it's very low-income, gang-infested area. And on a whim, they decide they're going to join. They're going to enroll. They're going to sign up for a national contest, robotics competition, and they're in high school, Carl Hayden High School, which is now actually a Gear Up school. They go to this contest in California. It's all colleges and community colleges, MIT, all these folks, right? And there's videotape of this contest 10 years ago. So they compete. They have to drop this thing in a pool, and they compete against MIT and all these other top-notch engineering schools. They have to present. They have to do all these sorts of things. Ends up, Carl Hayden High School wins the national contest 10 years ago. Right? 4 high school kids, undocumented. And so you're watching the movie, and we screened it at our event, which, it spoke to our people, right? Because they're all serving low-income students in terms of the aspiration, the belief in kids, and all those sorts of things. But here's the part that crushed me. And there's all sorts of stuff about DREAM Act legislation. I'm not getting into that. Here's the part that crushed me. In the documentary, the director, Mary Mazia, who's a friend, 10 years later, because they're interviewing the kids for the documentary and everything, they take the 4 kids. MIT finally invites the 4 kids from Carl Hayden 10 years later to MIT to meet the kids they beat who were in college at the time. Right? So they go to MIT, and here's where my heart just sank. Kids are meeting. They do a little robotics competition with middle schoolers. It's awesome. You're like, this is what education's all about. Then the kids sit down with each other, and they're talking about, the MIT kids are like, wow, you really took it to us, and, our presentation wasn't that great. And they're like, oh, well, what are you guys doing now? Right? The MIT kids were like, one was looking for Amelia Earhart's plane in the ocean with this massive underwater robotics company. One was at the leading sort of underwater, science biological institute. I mean, they had awesome jobs. Carl Hayden kids, one was part-time at a catering business, one was a janitor. I mean, literally. One kid had gotten through college. Right? The kid who got through college self-deported himself to get back in legally. As soon as he got back in legally, he signed up for the Army and went to Afghanistan. But he's now an engineer, having had his degree paid through the Army. Right? What broke my heart was this. This is what I saw when I watched that part of the clip. MIT, low-income kids, diverse populations. To the diverse population kids, that's what the world looked like. A series of points to get to that were disconnected. That's what I saw. Right? I thought about the kids I taught. So when you tell the kid, hey, you're at the moon, shoot for the stars, there's no bridges. How do you get from point to point to navigate this world? Right? So it's great to be academically ready, but how do they navigate a network? To the MIT kids, the world looked like this. Right? So you tell them to get from the moon to the stars. There's a network is set up. But not only that, they probably have greater skill sets to build a network, to navigate the network. I went to state schools. My wife, undergrad, went to Harvard, went to Dartmouth, and graduate school Harvard. So again, you're probably thinking, like, why isn't she the one talking to us? I will tell you, just anecdotally, the network she has from those schools compared to my schools are different. They are different. So when I think about one day my boys going to post-secondary education, wherever they go, value, bang for the buck, right? I went to a great undergrad, a small liberal arts school. Taught me how to think. Taught me how to write. I also want my post-secondary education for my boys to help them build these bridges, to navigate this. Right? Why? Because so much of the world every day is about that in so many jobs. Now, and again, I'm not making a political statement here, but I want to show you a video. I was watching this the other day. It was back to school around the country. We had a National Gear Up Week and all sorts of stuff. Secretary Duncan and President Obama were in Iowa kicking off back to school. They had like a bus tour. I just want you to listen to about 30 seconds of this.
The value of diversity is getting to know and understand people who are different from you, because that's the world you will be living in and working in. And it's actually really interesting that it's showing through a variety of studies that people who can understand and connect with a wide range of people, that ends up being as important a skill, if not more important a skill, than just about anything else in terms of your career success, whatever the field. It also, by the way, is part of what makes our democracy work.
So if those networks have to be built and navigated, and again, you could like Obama, you could like Trump, you could like whoever. It doesn't make any difference to me. Just in terms of that snippet of the statement, those networks are actually diverse. Right? The points that people are navigating are diverse. All the stopping points are not blue. Where I think this is such a massive opportunity for post-secondary education is this. Where do you have a greater lab to practice building and navigating diverse networks than post-secondary education? Nowhere. To practice on how to do that, many of your campuses are that. Right? And you're trying to make them more and more diverse in many ways. If you believe that networking, building networks, navigating networks are critical, and that they're diverse, that means diversity is not good just for the diverse kid. It's good for the entire student population. Because everybody has to navigate that world when they get out. It means financial aid is not good just for the kid getting financial aid. It's good for the entire student population. Because there's more diverse of a population for kids to practice, innovate with. It's a lab. Right? So this idea of the time frame of the race is really critical. Because some of these things traditionally, and maybe if your institutions are doing this now, and I don't mean can kids, visit a career center. I mean that they're practicing how to develop these skill sets. If you're doing this now, that's great. But many institutions aren't looking at that as they're navigating what is the delivery to students. My last piece here, and it's around demand and supply. So, we're in a supply and demand world. The world is proliferated by products and services. And the education industry is one of the biggest, right? I worked at two fairly large organizations, College Board and ACT, in terms of annual revenue. So the artifact here is this, the bubble sheet, the standardized test. Now, this test has a lot of tension around it right now. A lot of debate. People moving away from an admissions test optional, and all those sorts of things. So let me tell you one thing about this test that's important to the companies. It's imminently scalable compared to other types of assessment. Right? You can have a lot of kids take a test like this. You can score it fairly easily and return reports with data, valuable data. No doubt the data is valuable. To students, to users, to higher ed, to everybody else. It's very scalable. Right? Scalable is critical in this discussion. It is also critical in policy discussions. So the tension is this. So let's just practice one thing together real quick in terms of scalability, like a tipping point on scalability. And what tips that point? So I see Bob sitting back there. Bob, can you just read that for me fairly loud? Thanks. I create a bit of a network, and how about the other four people around Bob join him and read it together now? Now, if I get everybody in this room to yell that out in a second, go ahead and yell it out. Right? It starts to look like this. Right? That is the underpinnings of scalability. Right? What do companies care about? Demand. Now, the issue is, in my opinion, in the interactions between the education industry, companies, and education users, institutions, kids, parents, and families, is that we're a bit off kilter. And it's no one's real fault. Right? A company like College Board and ACT, they have a core competency. It's measurement. Right? But the tension that starts to happen is this. It's the same tension you felt in Common Core, outside of the politics of adoption. Here's the tension. Standards were developed. What do kids need to know and be able to do by the time they leave the K-12 system? They came up with Common Core standards. Then the discussion jumped to tests. Fairly immediately. I know, I was at ACT. You know. Right? How do we measure it? Will we know that these standards are having an impact? But here's where the tension came in. The test discussion was kind of around from an accountability mindset. How do we measure it? But everybody was sitting around saying, well, if Common Core standards are a strategy, what does everybody else do differently the next day once Common Core is rolled out? As opposed to a test adoption. What is the use, the practitioner use? What is each teacher doing differently towards those standards to get those kids ready in a different way? So eventually when you test them, the numbers move. Right? That is the tension that's going on in the marketplace. Because there's availability of scaled products. Tests, for example. But underpinning it, there's this weird nuance where everybody's like, well, how do I use this stuff? How do I improve anything based on this, rather than how do I just keep measuring? I know you all are looking at this. I think it's awesome. What do I do differently? Do I use the same test to get different results? Or do I need different types of information? Ultimately, right, if this was an ongoing relay race, never ending, that's why it runs off the chart. What you need to know, you measure it to get a baseline. How do you know where you're at? That's critical to have that data. You improve, you remeasure, you improve. I mean, when in your life now are you getting these measurements and people are saying, okay, that's done? But the critical insertion here is user actions. Right? When you do a performance review, if you're in business or teacher or whatever, your staff you're talking to kind of need to know, like, okay, well, I didn't do so well this year. How do I improve? What do I do? Right? So there has to be this tipping point in the marketplace around the type of information you need as a collective, and the collective actually may be bigger than Kentucky, to be able to improve growth rather than ready or not ready, graduate or not graduate along the way on this continual cycle, especially when post-secondary, and this is one of the best states for it, is reaching back into high school and middle schools. It's a leading state for that. But what's the type of information to be able to reach back on a growth model if the race is long? It seems to me that, I'm not very graphically inclined, but if this was some kind of a scale to some degree, there's a big supply in the standard to test discussion where everybody is craving this idea of, like, how do I use this information to get better, to help students get better? But there's an under demand. There hasn't been a scaled way. It's not just I need, it's describing how you want to use things. What do you need to be able to get it done? And then having a collective voice around that to start tipping the scale on scaling. Because that's the only way to do it. So with that, those are kind of my 3 points. Right? System impact. What is the system actually designed to do? What does the kid need to know and be able to do? Cognitive knowledge, skills, non-cognitive skills, 21st century skills, and when you receive them, where are they in that? And how do you sort of fill in that container for them so their race is long? And how will you know? How will you know? In the long run, it would just be ideal, outside of development and fundraising, if we could all really say, boy, these are where all the kids are going. And why? Second, this idea of the time frame, that the race is actually longer than the educational sector. Right? The governor made it about jobs yesterday when he travels. Hugely important. It's about citizenship. It's about a lot of things. Right? There's a lot of characteristics, but when you think about the plan, and the plan right now I think is great, and it's imminently buildable with a lot of metrics under it in terms of what you want your students of Kentucky to be and be able to do and know. And then finally, once you have that, you kind of have a baseline where they're at. But a strategy is about having action steps then to move those students through the pipeline. And ultimately, I think what you'll find is that you're going to need help, resources, and tools to do that, whether it's measurement or other things. And being able to communicate that based on the plan and where you're trying to go will be hugely critical and important for companies who may want to make the jump to be more impactful in the long run. So with that said, I want to thank you for having me here. I hope it gave you something to think about or something that's usable. And also, I just want to thank you all because I feel like I'm in a room where we're all sort of chasing the same thing in many ways. So thanks again.
We have time for one or two questions that people wanted to ask.
Sure.
Look at everybody raising their hands at one time.
Look at that.
Any questions that we need to ask him before we let him tip the plane off to celebrate his birthday? Once again, yeah.
This is a little different than something you touched on, but there's a lot of conversation and writing now in some circles about the freshman year and whether or not the way we traditionally structure freshman year really will enable us to do some of what we are trying to do. When you think about the way that most of us structure freshman year and your comments about how you identify what's needed, you measure, continuously improve, Do you have any comments about the way we structure freshman year and deliver it in relation to being able to achieve the goal as you've laid it out?
Yeah, I mean, I think freshman year, like for our student population, which is now many student populations, you know, if they're not ready in multiple categories, the support mechanisms for freshman year have to be a little bit different. So, you know, if you have the right kind of data, I think you can differentiate services in many ways. So I think the freshman year has to be restructured to some degree. I don't know what the answer to that is, just because of, I think I would compartmentalize it the way I did on the race. You have to have a different freshman year service orientation based on academic catch-up for many kids and proficiency. Not all, obviously. But the support mechanisms are hugely different depending on what kids are coming. So I sit on the board of an ed tech company that is trying to scale non-cognitive intervention. And so what it does is it actually sends to kids a text message with an embedded video, right? So they get what we call MIP. I forget what it stands for. But they get a video, and it gives them a 45-second video that says they're in their freshman year now, right? It also goes back into summer melt period. And it says, hey, how's everything going? You know, you feeling a little disconnected from your community and your family, whatever it may be. 45-second introduces a topic, then it gives them a 10-second survey on their phone about their behaviors in their first year of college. What are they doing? Are you going to class? You know, how are they coping with certain things? Captures the data. Then they get a 45-second video that says, here's some strategies if you're not feeling comfortable in the new culture. And many low-income kids probably aren't going off to a four-year campus or whatever. So it gives them some tips, who to outreach to, advisors, and all those sorts of things. But the key is that it captures the data. So what do you get then? You get differentiated counseling. Because there'll be a bunch of kids whose report comes back and it's in the green. Their behaviors seem to be really good. They're going to all their classes, they're turning in their work, whatever. There'll be kids in the middle round of a yellow and kids in a red. You start to differentiate your resourcing in the first year of who's getting what types of advisory services based on need. And so when I think about the race and those three sort of components, I differentiate it that way based on how do you get a world of enough information to differentiate constantly based on what they're doing.
Any other questions? Thank you, sir.
Great. Thank you.